Welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Before I hit record, we had just started talking a little bit about the history of how you came to Duquesne. You said that your time at Duquesne actually started before you were even here. So
Yes,
yeah, so tell us about that.
I'll summarize a little bit. But at Penn State, studying psychology, I also took a degree in philosophy, but I was sort of almost a persona non grata in the psychology department, which was heavily behavioristic at the time. My advisor just gave me my course card back and said, you sign it and choose what you want to do. But we had a great philosophy department there, and Alfonso Lingus and many others who inspired me to think along the lines of the existential phenomenology approach. And then to go one step further, though, I wrote letters to the authors of books that impressed me at the time. And, there were not many, but 5 or 6. And each of those people actually had the courtesy to write back. And, one was Ivan Illich, a Jesuit priest in Cuernavaca, Mexico. Another one was Sidney Koch, I think was at the University of North Carolina. And Rollo May was one. And they all said the same thing, go to Duquesne, go to Duquesne. So
what year?
No, that would have been 1969 in that ballpark, because I went in the Navy right after my undergraduate years. I graduated, I was in enlisted Navy and then became an officer after Penn State. And after 3 years in the Navy, I had applied to Duquesne and some other schools. But the story goes on in that I was at sea for a while. And at that time, everything was still snail mail. And I arrived in this port of Malta and I got my mail from weeks before. And there was my letter of acceptance to Duquesne. But unfortunately, I had missed the response deadline. So I quickly panicked, got on the phone as quickly as I could. Back then, communication wasn't as fluent as it is today. Called the department, spoke to a woman named Tilly Cohen, who was then the administrative assistant, I think. And Tilly just said to me, calm down. I think we can do something. I'm sure they'll work it out. I missed it by about a week and a half. So that was how I came to Duquesne. I decided then, of course, to leave the Navy, come back to Duquesne, and began what was an odyssey there from 1972 and to, in my case, 1990. And as I said to you, back then it was a different time. We weren't APA approved. More of the faculty were involved with your dissertation. You would often get feedback from a broader number of people than your 3 on the committee. And they had accepted us. It was a 2-year master's program at that time. And at the end of our 2-year master's program, which we thought was also a PhD program, they announced that they would be having us reapply to the PhD. And we did. And of course, we went through the angst of that. My class was somewhat whittled down, but a number went on, and I was one. So we went on and finished the education. It was wonderful to have professors, not only the standing faculty, which I think are considered sort of the forerunners of existential phenomenology, and I think in America certainly, but to have people like Viktor Frankl and Paul Ricoeur, who I got to know very well while he was there, others that came, Rollo May, Jürgen Habermas, others that just were so exciting. I mean, I can see why students were reluctant to graduate. They just want to stay and meet some of these wonderful people. We all knew we were in a groundbreaking situation. I mean, we were, at the time, we're actually proud we were not APA, because that gave us a distinction separate. And our studies were very rigorous. Everyone took the role of early existential phenomenology very seriously, and how it would be applied to either social psychology with someone like Rolf van Rakensberg, or in thinking like Amadeo Giorgi back then, or in the science of what it meant to be a human science, or in clinical practice, where I seem to lean more with faculty like Chuck Mays and Tony Barton, and of course Connie Fisher. So we went through it, took it all very seriously. But then we were also encouraged to take our work seriously, but take our life seriously. So I ended up working in prisons outside of my work at Duquesne. So I went from being a naval officer to, working in a gas station. Interesting change. But went through the years and met wonderful people and learned, and still am learning about what we called then a science of continual beginnings. Phenomenology is always a re-beginning of understanding meaning and purpose. And that's what I call it today, a science of purpose. I finished Duquesne after wonderful training in a dissertation where I spent years studying the psychology of human imprisonment. I went into maximum security and interviewed people, but I also came to realize that people could be imprisoned in their own life by the structures they create, sometimes in their own very successes. And those things become, both imprisoning and sometimes just, restricting. But inside the jails, I realized that the defense systems were so strong that jails were really universities for sociopathy. And not much could be done there therapeutically. And when we did do successful things there, it often made the inmate vulnerable in the population or his or her world. That was my dissertation. And I remember the very distinct moment that I was defending, and one of the faculty challenged me, who ordinarily I would have backed up and said, uh-oh. But in this particular moment, this particular time, I looked at that faculty person and said, no, that's not the way I saw it, or not the way I found it. And all of a sudden, the whole room smiled. And I think that was the very instant when they saw me own my work. And even the person who asked the question smiled. And that wasn't what I had seen or found. So that was a great day. It took so long, I really didn't tell people for a while. I just sat on it quietly and enjoyed it, and then went on. While I was there at that time, I became the opportunity to went to St. Francis Hospital. And I left it working in the jails and the prisons, and worked in St. Francis with prominent psychiatrist at the time, Dr. Abraham Tversky. And Dr. Tversky and I were very close. He loved the alcoholic, and I said, well, you take care of the alcoholic and I'll take care of the drug addict. And that was a big step for St. Francis, because we had that population in our hearts, always there. The sisters felt that no matter what, you had to show respect and dignity to the patients. And we were the first hospital in America to use the diagnosis of alcoholism for a treating disorder back in 1945. Of course, I wasn't there then. But so I went to St. Francis and ran their drug treatment program for a number of years. And I can remember many wonderful things, even with Duquesne. We started a clinical clerkship for medical students, and for 20 years brought Duquesne students in every summer for 2-3 week sessions, and they loved it, and they really grounded the medical students and made the whole experience rich for everybody. I can remember the one day that I went out, and Chuck Mays was in my waiting room and said, what brings you here, Chuck? And he said, I have a favor to ask. I said, what's that? He said, and Chuck for me was kind of a almost a mystical man, if you knew him. But we used to joke as students that he was really Don Juan, Carlo Castaneda's Don Juan. But Chuck was there, and I was in awe of Chuck. And said, what brings you? He said, I want to know if I could just sit in the emergency room for a while. And I said, sure. So I took him over to the emergency room, and he sat there, came back over later, thank you. And he said he'd like to come back and take a tour of the hospital. I said, well, sure, I could do that for you. So HIPAA wasn't as restrictive then or even around, but still we had to protect confidentiality. But Chuck came back another day, and he visited, and we took a tour of the hospital and the psych wards. And he was impressed by all of what he saw, but I still wasn't sure why he was coming. He left, and then about a week later, he called and came back, and I said, what now? And he said, I want to ask if we could find a way to put the doctoral students either in the ER or somewhere on the floor, because I think they need to keep the perspective of why they are doing what they want to do. And I said, well, gee whiz, Chuck, that we could do that. I'm sure we could find a way, but and I was thinking, what was he really trying to say and do? We did, and but on the way home from that visit that particular day, I got a phone call later, and it was, did I know this man, Chuck Mays? I said, yes. This was the Central Medical Hospital downtown Pittsburgh. Chuck had had a heart attack after he left my office, was admitted to Central Medical, and subsequently died there. So the only thing they could find on him that day that gave identification was the fact that he had my business card in his wallet. And they called me at St. Francis, and I immediately, of course, got there and called Richard Knowles, Dick Knowles, and Tony Barton, who were very close, and everybody came to the hospital just before he passed away. And that led to some of our Duquesne student program, where we bring the students into the medical student clerkships. No one ever followed through, though, to bring them back to the emergency room or to the floors. Chuck felt that they needed to keep that perspective to really understand why they were doing what they were doing. Other situations I could go on with Duquesne, but experiences, with Tony Barton, I remember in a group therapy class listening, for example, and attentively listening to people in the group speaking. And one of the co-members said to me, "Why aren't you speaking, Dr. Barton? Why do you let Flaherty be so quiet?" And Tony said to me, "What do you say about that, Mike?" And I said, I don't know. I was just really listening, and I didn't know that was something wrong. And he laughed. He said, "It's not. Just be what you are there. Listen well, respond when you can." And I knew that was a growth moment too for me, a particular one, not to mention all of the wonderful academics and the thought. I could find no end to my thinking at Duquesne and the richness of the experience. As I graduated, and even while I was still waiting to get my Ph.D. finished, I came to realize that in the real world, phenomenology itself and qualitative research was priceless. In my early days at St. Francis, I was successful in writing what became known as CEDAR, the Center for Education Drug Abuse Research, a 24-year NIDA grant. Very rare to get something for 24 years, but we looked at the genetic vulnerability to substance use in intergenerations of youth from parents who had substance problems, with Dr. Ralph Tarter and Dr. Moss from Western Cycling University, Pittsburgh. And I remember looking at the data, and I was the one that came in and said, well, we don't need to have an N of 50. I need to know what the N of 1 said. Like how did this affect the child? Don't tell me that there's 1 of 20 children. I need to, that had symptoms. I want to know what affected the child, so I can, the meaning of how that went. And my colleagues just laughed, and they said, Mike, we're never going to get this study done. NIDA would never have it. They want hundreds of N's. But we succeeded, and we wrote over 300 papers over 24 years, published in journals on the vulnerability to substance use. And then I think one of the highlights became, as I grew, Dr. Tworski eventually departed St. Francis. And the Sisters of St. Francis said, would I replace him? Well, you don't replace a legend. And he was a legend. So I said, I'll do what I can, but I'll never tackle the legend. And I quietly became the first non-medical director of their Institute for Psychiatry and Addictions. I say quietly because we had 67 psychiatrists on staff. And as a PhD psychologist, or actually at the time I may have been still a master psychologist, I didn't want to play a union card too loud. But the hospital succeeded. We were the largest in the state of Pennsylvania. We reached over 30,000 people a year easily, developed innovative programs that are still in Pittsburgh today, treating maternal addiction for women with babies. And I was just on a call before now on that topic, identifying, fetal alcohol syndromes and things, incarceration. We built an alternative to incarcerate, first ever in Allegheny County, a number of things in addition to our standard mental health, substance use, and inpatient units. And it was a great time in my life. I think probably the center of my work life. Along the way, I went back into the Navy as a reservist, and it dealt with my Indiana Jones side. That was when I gave up doing my clinical work, and I would just put on my Navy hat and go to sea or do something there. And it was a great diversion. I was talking about that to a student yesterday, about how you practice psychology. And that was what I learned: keep some diversity and use your principles at higher places, and come back to your practice where you really learn where those principles come from. So everything I've done has been grounded in probably patient work, clinical work, and then taken perhaps to a higher level or a different level, but always that grounding, that qualitative grounding. And that's what got me to St. Francis. Stayed there for 22 years, went on and started my own research and policy center at downtown Pittsburgh, still there, at the Institute for Research, Education, Training, and Addictions, Treatment Addictions. And that's now going on 22 years. I ran that for 10 years. It took 10 years to get a piece of science into practice. So I had determined, again, using qualitative thinking, that we could shorten that 10 years if we had ways of bridging these gaps. And then also eventually reversing like the science of what I call knowledge adoption. And this is where qualitative research and phenomenology is critical. All of the fine scientific or large N science remains in books, but it doesn't get adopted unless we get into how the people receive information and adopt it. And there's a whole science I learned for 5 years. I ran a National Addiction Technology Transfer Center where we studied knowledge dissemination and knowledge adoption, and how to take science and put it into the hands of people and communities, and see higher rates of adoption and transformation. And that's a unique science, but it is almost all qualitative. Mm-hmm. And this qualitative understanding is a door untapped, I think, for many of our Duquesne students. So I did that I read it for about 15 years, and then I decided at a certain point in time, changing policies, and that I wanted to focus expressly on building recovery. And that was probably the major contribution of my life in my career, short of my Navy career, which I'll mention, because along the way, I was being called into war. I was being called off to duty. I was being called off the different commands I was in charge of. I remember the sisters calling me in one day and saying, Michael, you're going off to war, and you work for the Sisters of St. Francis. St. Francis was a pacifist. And then we're having a hard time explaining why the head of our psychiatry is always going to war. And I said, sister, you have to understand, if it weren't for me going to war, you wouldn't have St. Francis. That's how we protect. Strength protects freedom. And at the time, they gave me the gratitude of understanding my position. So I continued there on that. But I went on and began to become more and more interested in a science that we had that only dealt with pathology. And in the early of, say, 1998, 1999, 2000, I brought together a group of the 50 top scientists and substance use clinicians, prevention experts. And this is, of course, I give great credit to the fact that computers came in at the same time, so I could do these things. And I brought these wonderful people together on computer meetings, and they all had the same interest to say, we are not treating this illness with the right science. We are treating a chronic illness with an acute science. and you get 2 episodes of treatment in your lifetime. You only get so many visits. You get so, and if not that, you go to jail. Well, that's the acute model. That's the medical model. What would it be if it was a chronic model? So we wrote a book. I wrote it. It's a small book called Special Report on How to Change Science and Addictions. And it was quickly adopted across at least those 50 leaders, who then spread it further, information spreading. And that, with the help of others, and the Institute of Medicine, at that time I went there and worked with them for a while in Washington, we were able to change the paradigm, understanding of substance use from an acute illness to a chronic illness. And that was a real wonderful expression and day for all of us. And we wrote then from there 7 or 8 more basic books on how to treat the illness with chronic. Worked with leaders such as William White and Ernie Kurtz, national leaders of people who are in recovery. I remember a woman coming to a meeting and crying and just saying, "You finally brought the patient back into the tent." Now, when you're studying from the patient what the illness is like, illness-driven models versus, scholarly down models. And it was we kept doing it, and I ended up traveling the country. I've spoken in 48 states now, helped and designed recovery models, either in local agencies or counties or states. I just was on a call now. We're looking at tying social detriments of health to sentences of criminal justice. So can we mitigate sentences in criminal justice by saying these people have higher risks because of social detriments? And that was one of the things, but that's just one. But to build recovery, and I've built several models in places in the country where we've almost stopped overdose deaths. We certainly have stopped suicides using a recovery-focused model, because everything in behavioral care is driven by money, and money is driven by episode. And you can't treat human behavior in episodes like that. It won't work. So, but this is not me alone. There's an army across the country. In fact, across the world. I published a study several years ago on pathways to recovery and diverse pathways of recovery, looking at African American women, women generally, men with some of, and we followed these, and we did a qualitative study, much like a dissertation, and came out, and that will probably stay out there for another 5 or 6 years before somebody, but people all in Africa and Germany and all using this paper now. It'll just come back. The data is solid, and the pathways identified is that recovery isn't the same for an African American, isn't the same for females, and inviting others to come back and tell us more. That's one of the papers. So that it brings me up to almost today, where I've devoted myself now at this point in life to things that are only passion, and I find that's great joy, and I can look back and say I felt that same passion originate when I arrived at Duquesne. Other than the awe that I often felt when I got there. The fear of that comes with awe, and I said this to a conference a few years back at Duquesne, and my colleagues kind of had a hard time hearing it, but there's never been more opportunity in this world than there would be for qualitative analysis research. The science of purpose, or human science. The model of recovery is exactly just that. We went to people and said what worked, and where did you get your illness, and when did the change start? And we published studies on that, and the whole thing reversed itself. And all of a sudden, the other scientists had to say, yes, this isn't an acute condition, this is chronic. And as I mentioned to you in an email, that we had Larry Davidson working on mental health. Pat Deegan has done a lot with peer supports and people in recovery, mental health recovery, and none of us ever talked. We were just 3 Duquesneites changing the world. And then one day when I said, well, who's doing this good in mental health? I found Larry. Then another day, who's really doing it from the consumer perspective in mental health? It was Pat. And we brought those into, for example, the managed care company in Pittsburgh, the community care. I founded that. And it has recovery principles all behind it. And Pat Deegan is our advisor to our consumer development plan. And that's a big effort that St. Francis and UPMC did. And it's now covering all the Medicaid lives in Pennsylvania. And it's a nonprofit. There aren't any nonprofit managed care companies. Managed care companies are by definition sharks. And what this one does is anything it saves, it gives back to communities. And we measure recovery as our goal of managed care. And there was never a restriction on number of visits, never a restriction, that would say, you don't qualify for help. The first bill we paid was for tires, so somebody could get to rural Pennsylvania. It's a managed care company with a soul, and it's all built on this also, and with university ages. And sometimes that's been challenging. So those are the highlights. I'm trying to think if there's anything else with I read it. Rosk, big event was coming to Duquesne, learning what I could. St. Francis and becoming the first non-medical director at that time and all that went with it. And then Rosk and building recovery, which is today population health. And if we're to understand population health, we have to understand human behavior. And I'm at that practical level of implementation. I love studying Merleau-Ponty. I love studying Aaron Gerich, and Lacan, but I'm really more in the school of Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and the science of medicine as we know it. And bringing those two things together is a qualitative approach. So that's been the success of my life. I hope each student that sees this film, if they do, can find that same pathway, and that even though phenomenology may be challenged in academia, with other approaches, other books of knowledge, and I know that's hard, but in the real world, its day has never been brighter if people want to go to it and speak to it, and affecting policies. I used to say to myself, why not? Why can't things work? And then when I got into answers, it was because we didn't do the qualitative or the personal or the analytic. And there was always a way to get into that and then find people. And I've written some of these things in some of my books about how to make systems change and what you need to do that to make you have to do a qualitative analysis of how people come to laws or policies, and then take that apart. Who makes those laws and policies? And then from there, you go back into, well, how do we get those people at the table and rethink these things from a human science point of view? And it always has just opened up more doors. So.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how your experience at Duquesne prepared you for your work at St. Francis? You go into this position where your training is a little bit unusual for someone in your role. All of a sudden, you're really influential. You're dealing with a really big system. You're trying to make some pretty significant changes. What was it about the experiences that you had at Duquesne, or the things that you learned that set you up to do that work?
Really, I think at that time it was often the reading of someone like Rollo May, or the teaching of things like what I mentioned that Chuck Mays had brought up, and Tony Barton, Bill Fisher. And when I got to St. Francis, I realized how distant the science of the textbook was from the experience that I felt just being with patients, or just being in the prison. I remember going to the prison when I first started at Western Penitentiary, and I think 2/3 of the people I saw were there because of substance use, yet there was nobody with a substance use program there. I doubt there still is. Yeah. And I thought, this is irrelevant. What are we doing? So when I got to St. Francis, when I got to St. Francis, the word we used was rigor. I had confidence in the rigor of qualitative analysis and qualitative approaches. I had behind me a science that was, I thought, uh, every bit as impeccable as anything from an objectivistic science. The methods that Andy Georgi taught us, others had similar methods. Um, the deep philosophy and the thinking through of what human nature was, and realizing acutely that a human science wasn't what was being practiced. What was being practiced was an objective science, which, unbeknownst to itself, roots were based in physics. So I had faith in that distinction. And when I got to St. Francis, I realized very acutely when I walked around with the patients that most of their times there was no one reaching to them or hearing them. I think that's what Chuck may have been coming to get in touch with too. And but I also knew I had behind me the rigor of a science that wasn't contradictory to the objectivist science. That was absolutely, I never thought that, nor was I ever treated as if it was contradictory. It was an augmentation of the objectivistic science, or the scientific, and it was the more meaningful adoption of treatment and of curing, if you will, of the nature of being a curer. And because I was able to transport that in the whole hospital in psychiatry, and brought speakers in constantly who were aligned with that, and opened up spirituality further than it was even at a place like St. Francis. But more importantly, wanted to see people get well, not just 2 days and out. And the sisters were behind me on that. They wanted wellness. So it was human characteristics that were the ones that, and I felt there was a science, and it wasn't just being a good person. It was really the fact that this is what changes human beings, and this is what nature is. And knowing I had a science behind me. And, and when I would talk to some of the faculty on different visits or whatever, I was always encouraged, to, yes, keep going, and tell us more. But even they were moving in a different direction, more scholarly and more, academically, where I was in this very applied world. But the gap was obvious, and it was all. And when I met with the university, I would sit silent in meetings. I never felt I was excluded. I just waited my turn to bring the qualitative to it, so that they didn't wait 3 years to ask the question, well, why don't we have an adoption here? Because they forgot the qualitative up front and how to put those structures in place. And it was always a complementary science for me. And I appreciated, like I wrote a paper early on, the physiology of spirituality. And it was a little bit, I think I presented it one time to a class at Duquesne. And, but what does it mean in the brain when an illness comes, and what does it mean in the brain when wellness comes? And the student said to me, well, you're being a reductionist. And I said, no, I'm using meaning as treatment and purpose. Frankl, today has been a big help to me with COVID, getting people through COVID with Frankl's principles from his writing. I just read his essays right after he got out of concentration camp. Those are real. And I think one thing that really benefited me was back then they insisted that we have our own turn in therapy. I suspect you probably still do, where the doctoral students kind of see other students for therapy or something, but we had to experience therapy. So we didn't go out the door just believing therapy existed, but we had to know therapy worked. And I knew that in hand. And it wasn't just pharmacological. I knew pharmacological was only aids. And I've always believed the core was in the person themselves. And today, physiology and the brain and plasticity and neural development of brain cells are all supporting that. A healthy mind leads to a healthy brain cell. A healthy attitude leads to a healthy mind. And that's where therapy comes in. So I have felt confident. I think the clinical training was priceless. I remember one day Chuck Mays called me into his office and I thought, oh, this is going to be great. And took me in the back room and laid me out on a chalkboard. Dismantled me. Well, here's what you are. Here's what your weaknesses are. Here's what your tendencies are. And then when I was all over the floor in pieces, he smiled and he said, now let's put it back together. But, and I remember that. And I think that was a life-changing moment for me there. I mean, it was done very constructively and not, there's an old Jesuit philosophy, I think you take apart and then you put back. But, I just remembered seeing myself, knowing myself, and taking that into what I learned and remembering that the key advisor to everything I was doing was the patient sitting in front of me. And everything, no matter how abstract it got. Whether it's, postmodernism or pre-modernism, it's the patient. So it was priceless. And maybe it was a benefit that I was there. Those 18 years or 16 years, most of the time I was working. I was doing, a life and working on a dissertation. I had to do several rewrites of my dissertation, mostly because at that time, believe it or not, we still had typewriters.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And I got tired of erasing. And I'd get up at 4 a.m. finally and work from 4 to 7, then go off to work. Yes, but I got 2 or 3 hours in that, got me done. Bill Fisher was a great help. He pulled me aside and said, I'm not on your committee, but if you get me on it, I know I'll get you through this. And this was probably after the 3rd rewrite. And I said, okay, Bill, I did. And I asked him, Rolf stepped back, Bill came on and whatever that was, but I got through it. And but it was all hand typed. And I had a secretary at St. Francis, but at that time I was the head of St. Francis, and I paid her to type it separately, and it came out in a readable manner. Great. I have no resentments. Just wonderful. And I everywhere I go, whether it's in France or in Ireland, people know about Duquesne. They know about existential phenomenology. They treat it with respect, as we did. I just wish there were more of us, but maybe that's the way it should be.
What advice would you have for a young person maybe just starting their time at Duquesne, or thinking about coming to Duquesne, or thinking about pursuing graduate training, who is interested in using that qualitative perspective to make really applied, concrete change in the world? Structural change.
Well, think outside the box a little bit in terms of policy making changes. Every policy has come from people's thoughts, mostly, of trying to do what's best for the group. And when you realize that we change, whether this is postmodernism or that we're just changing as society itself. But for that young student to realize that my motto would be work with your patients, but then keep half your time to go out and change the world based on your patient care. And not be afraid to go into circles of policymakers or high academics in other institutions, but do not define yourself as opposite, but as complementary, and wait for the opportunity or create the opportunity to bring the qualitative to whatever the law, the policy is. For example, right now we're working on changing healthcare to get more diverse and equitable access. And that's a change. If we leave it as it is, it won't. So a student today at Duquesne could look to say, well, how do I take this understanding of what the value of that is? Does it make a difference if there are more minority members in the psychology population? Absolutely. How do I get that diversity in place? How do I work on it? It's going to take years, but at least we're going in the right direction. And there is a satisfaction of saying, well, if I get more people into these roles, we can have improved outcomes and better results. So don't be afraid to ask those questions, even if it's at a school board meeting. But to be active and balance your qualitative basis of your clients. Today, we live in a world of, with COVID, but political anxieties, and we've come through a terrible time. Many people think we're going into a dark age. I don't. I think that we're into disarray and dismantling of our society as we know it, but hopefully it'll come back to a way where psychologists and students from Duquesne can feel the challenge and the opportunity that there are, in my mind, absolutes. Human nature has certain absolutes, and that, if we're talking and all of a sudden a car crashes outside our window, both of us will probably have some kind of a similar reaction to that accident, to that terrible accident. And those commonalities are broad, and if we can get to them, understanding them, we can create a more harmonious world, which is what qualitative analysis does. And that's the healing factor again. We have to go deeper. We're too shallow. Today, we're very much counselors and being made into so more. But the deeper issues, I think, are what we have to focus on, whether we go deeply into individuals or deeply into our communities, and use that value. Not loud, we don't be obnoxious. People will come out and say, well, why isn't this working if we haven't changed it? Well, because a person didn't adopt it. Why didn't they adopt it? There's where the work is.
And what about for somebody who has graduated from Duquesne, is going to work in, let's say, a large agency of some kind, and dealing with these questions about, like, oh, you studied what? Philosophy, phenomenology, qualitative research. What advice would you have for that person about how to work in an environment that might be skeptical of the gifts that they bring?
Well, it depends on where they're entering. If they come in at an academic level, I think they're going to have their work cut out. There aren't but a few institutions, as you know, Elizabeth, around the country that you would walk into academically and people would say, oh, I'm just so happy to have a Duquesne person here. There are, because they're rivaling academics. And I know my classmates who went into academia, often bemoan the status of phenomenology, postmodernism, et cetera, and the acceptance of existential practices, and they don't feel like they're readily appreciated. Perhaps in the division of APA they are, but not broadly. But I would say to them ultimately, as I would to the clinician, you're probably the most important person in the department or in the room. There is nobody looking at what you're seeing, and there is or few people, and and the qualitative differences you will make you a standout almost immediately. When we brought the Duquesne students into the medical school clerkship, the students came every summer for 2-3 week periods. Medical students came from all over America, and they were given the best medical training they could. And they had all the book knowledge of what an addiction was and how it worked in the brain and what medications to treat it, et cetera, et cetera. But it was the Duquesne students that brought them to saying, here's how it comes about, here's how it will work in treatment, and here's why your processes will only go so far in a isolated, siloed, truncated system. But this is what continuing care will look like. This is what recovery will look like. And this is what changes human beings. And many of those medical students kept in touch with the Duquesne students for years after. So, and I think that's what I would say to them. You're the most valuable person in the room. Don't think of that, though, because I think being a phenomenologist, psychologist, is a sense of humility to begin with. In order to have access to another person, we have to have humility and our own faults. Again, that's where humanistic or phenomenological psychology can really be the biggest asset. We started the Impaired Colleague Assistance Program years ago when I was in Pennsylvania, and a couple of us, and we learned very quickly that psychologists were wonderful with compassion for patients, but they were not compassionate to their peers. And they were very harsh on their peers. So if one of our colleagues had a drinking problem, one of our colleagues had a problem where they were financially in debt, or went through a divorce, or perhaps, you know, other things, that the compassion wasn't there, that it was for that. So, and that's why, again, the qualitative said we're missing something, and that qualitative missingness is what I think Duquesne opens the psychologist to finding and contributing. And down deep inside, people always resonate with it. They there's a funny story I can share that when I was there at Duquesne, we said, imagine a left fielder for the Pirates who was a phenomenologist. Okay, and the left fielder is there, and the ball was hit, and it's coming to him, and he's saying to himself, the ball, it's in motion, it's white, it's round, and it's coming my way. But eventually somebody in the back in the bleachers is going to scream, catch the ball, you son of a... And that's where the Duquesne person comes in. Like, you can describe, understand, catch the ball, stay where you are. I think the kids young people you're educating, I hope they realize the gift they're getting. And you, the faculty that replaced my mentors, I'm trying to think of the name of one fellow. He was a veteran too. We talked a few times. But the gifts that you offer, and in some ways the legacy that you have, it's hard, but it's priceless. It really is. It's a science that has still not gotten to where you are, and yet it's older. It's older than all of the sciences in some ways. If you go back to Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and others, before that, it goes back so far in that richness, and yet it's standing right in front of us today. But as economics come and as science goes today, economics is driving everything, and the role of the phenomenologist, the long studied, detailed analysis, is being diminished. So we have to look for other ways to show that the shortcuts are still going to need, some insights into how they can be disseminated and transmitted and adopted. And that science is still novel, I think.
Is there anything else that you want to say that you haven't had a chance to yet?
I don't think so. I miss my faculty there. I wish I could come back and see the people I've named, and the spirit you create. And I hope that the young students coming in don't lose faith in what they're getting. I've traveled I've been on dissertations all around this country, of committees and things like that. Nobody's getting the wealth of clinical experience that you're giving these young students, and the opportunity to apply it. And then they just have to decide, do they want to be a psychoanalyst, and go that deep into that much, or do they want to find a way to be who they are going to be at some lighter level, some lesser level, but nonetheless more functional level and way of being. But we can't lose it, because if we lose that, we lose our purpose, and we lose our very... That's another form of prison. My dissertation. But thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.